So, buying a championship, will it Moneyball? Let's find out. Okay, so first things first, this was easily the most tedious Will It Moneyball video I've had to make. Went through a lot of, I actually screwed something up, so I had to completely go over all my data again. It's a very long couple of days getting all this together to make a video, but I think I came up with some pretty cool stuff, so hopefully you guys enjoy it. But yeah, basically what I wanted to see was if you spend more money in free agency, does that help you or does that hurt you? And if it does help you, how much does it help you? Because I was interested in seeing really if this is something a team should do, especially with free agency coming up. I thought it would be a fascinating topic. And so the first thing I had to do was I had to go through every single team, figure out how much money they spent per year, and figuring out how that affected them. So what I did was I could only find data for the past 10 years, but here's what I did. So what you see right here is every single team from the past 10 years, where they ranked in terms of how much money they spent and how that affected them in terms of the win-loss column. So right here is the chart that I made for it. As you see, it's a bit all over the place. I mean, there is kind of a slight line down, and just to explain what the chart is, the further to the left you are, that's the more a team spent in cap space. The further to the right, that's the less you spent in cap space. And then the higher up is how much wins was added to your record. So the most was a little over 2.5, and the least was right around negative 2.5, which means, you lost 2.5 more games than you won. As you can see, it is a bit all over the place. There are a couple of plots that are kind of surprising. Like, for example, weirdly, being 18th on this is the highest amount of wins added to your team. But I think a lot of that is just luck. The 2016 Cowboys, who added Dak and Zeke, and the 2012 Vikings, who just added Brett Favre, saw big jumps really unrelated to how they did in free agency. So I think that's kind of why there's an outlier there. You also have number 3 is lower than I think you would expect, because the 2018 Jaguars, where Bortles kind of fell off, and the 2011 Buccaneers, where Freeman kind of fell off, affected that a little bit. So there are a couple of outliers. So to try and fix some of these outliers, I put it into grouping. Right here, what I did was I got the top 2 and then just went in groups of 5 down the rest of the way. And you see that, listen, if you pay the most or second most money in free agency, you're adding about a 1.5, which is something. It's not completely game changing, but it's something and definitely can be effective if you're a team that's maybe a win or 2 away. And then, as you go down a little bit, it starts to get lower and lower, but then weirdly, it gets a little bit muddled here in the middle. I would have expected personally for it to continue going down and then, just keep going down, because just logically that would make sense. The more money you spend, the better off your team should be, and the less money you spend, the worse off your team should be. But as you see, you add a little under a win for 3 through 7. You actually lose about half a win for 8 through 12, but then go back to getting half a win if you pay 13th through 17th. Then you lose a win and a half. Then you lose just a win and under a win. So it's a bit all over the place, and I'm not sure exactly what the truth is here, but I do know one thing is that if you pay a good amount of money, you're going to be a little bit better. If you don't pay a ton of money, you're probably going to be a little bit worse. I find that stuff kind of interesting. I don't really know how well I can take that into consideration. I think that maybe the biggest surprise is that if you just take the top 2, the best you can do is add a 1.5 to your team, which I would have guessed it would be a little bit higher than that. I also would have guessed it would have been a little bit lower than only losing about 1 win when you finish in the bottom of the rankings there. I would have guessed you maybe lose, a couple of wins there. But then again, I guess there is some logic. So I wanted to go through, and I wanted to really just figure out, how does it affect you in terms of winning a Super Bowl? Because gaining wins is one thing, gaining regular season wins is one thing, but us obviously getting to the Super Bowl and winning it is a lot more important. So that's what I did with my next chart. Right here, as you see, the average for a team that made the Final Four, which is the NFC or AFC championship game, they spent it's actually the back half, barely, but it is. It's a little over 16th place that they were in. So basically, there's not really much correlation towards spending and getting very far. And in fact, the average team that's where they ended up in terms of placement of money spent that won the Super Bowl is 18.2. So they're even further back. So that was really surprising to me. I would have guessed it would be way higher because, again, you're spending money. I would think that your team is going to be better. So what does this mean? Does, spending money in free agency, is that actually a bad thing? I mean, a team that finished in the top 5 has not won the Super Bowl in the past 10 years, although the Ravens are an exception. They finished 6th and they won it in 2012. So, just missed the top 5, but still pretty fascinating. And in fact, there was only a small handful of teams that finished in the top 5 and even made it to the NFC or AFC championship game. So this is the Baltimore Ravens and some of the guys that they added. Really, Webb was the key guy, getting a cornerback. That seemed to be the main thing they did. Jacoby Jones, he wasn't signed to a big deal, but was a key playmaker. Also Ben Grubbs, offensive lineman. So, they added some pieces here and there. They won a Super Bowl and, it helped because of the free agency stuff. So that's interesting to me. These are the 4 teams that finished in the top 5 of teams that spent money the year prior and then also ended up making it to the conference championship game. These were the 4 teams. The New England Patriots actually make it on here. I know they have a reputation of not spending money, but, they made it on here. And it was largely through, they re-signed some guys, Dante Hightower, who I accidentally put an extra apostrophe in his name. Apologize about that, Dante. You also have Stephon Gilmore, of course, he was the big one, and Logan Ryan. And you're going to start to notice a trend right here. So there was a cornerback with the Ravens, a cornerback with the Patriots, and largely defense there. The Jaguars were all defense. They basically built an entire defense just simply out of free agency. The Packers on the bottom, again, all defense. And the New Orleans Saints in 2018, it was essentially all defense as well. Also, I wrote Brew Brees instead of Drew Brees. Jesus, so many typos. What's going on here? But anyways, yeah, so Drew Brees was kind of the exception to some degree. They re-signed him, which, yes, re-signings, they do affect this as well. But they also added Demario Davis, who was a key piece for the New Orleans Saints for these past few years, getting a all-pro linebacker. That obviously helps. So really, defense is kind of the key way to have success if you are going to try to build a team, at least in part through free agency. But I also want to really focus on the 2017 Jaguars because they are the complete anomaly in this entire list. All of this data collection, the Jaguars are clearly the one team that stood out in 2017. No team had more success spending the most amount of money in a single offseason than Jacksonville in 2017. Literally every other team that finished first did not do as well. The close second would be Miami, who went from 5 wins to 10 wins just this past offseason. That's probably a close second, although I think there's plenty of other factors. And other than that, no team finished with a record of above 500 that was there, with the exception of the New York Jets, who actually went from 12 wins to 10 wins, despite spending the most in 2015. So typically, if you spend the most money, things can go okay for you, but it's not going to be a huge jump. Jacksonville was just the one exception that year. So what you see right here is, what I did was I looked at every single team that had a shift of 6 or more wins, whether it's positive or negative, and tried to figure out the biggest reason for why that was. So for some guys, their quarterback just fell off, and so that cost them a bunch of wins, or there was an injury, or maybe, a coaching change. Coaching change was the biggest one. The draft came into play. Getting a new quarterback came into play. There were a few, which I just really struggled to come up with an exact reason for why they had such a shift. The 2012 Detroit Lions, who I think you can make an argument it was because they were 27th in terms of spending money, and they could have used some holes, but still losing 6 games was a bit odd. Same thing with the 2013 Atlanta Falcons. The 2013 Atlanta Falcons were wild. They had some injuries, but they also went from 13-3 to 4-12, and Matt Ryan was healthy. Like, they had plenty of good stuff there, so some injuries, and they still spent 13th most money. So it wasn't like they were just, letting guys walk either. And the final one was the 2015 Panthers, who, jumped up to having a 15-1 season. That was Cam Newton's MVP season. Maybe it was just as simple as Cam Newton went off one year and that changed things. And also Josh Norman playing really well certainly helped with that as well. So that's it. But what I find very interesting, and the number one interesting fact on this chart, was that if you look at adding free agents, that's third from the bottom, only one team had a significant jump from adding free agents. It was that 2017 Jacksonville Jaguars team. So what does this all mean? Well, it means several things. For one thing, I think that we can pretty safely say if you're a 4-12 team, don't try to build it back through free agency. You can pick someone and maybe get a long-term deal if you think that can sort of help you, but it's going to be a slow build, and you're not going to be able to build a team through free agency. Even the one exception to that rule the past 10 years, they completely fell off the following year. So you can try to build a team through free agency, but it's probably not going to work. Now, you can pick up pieces through free agency. I mean, listen, look at Tampa Bay, for example. I think that's a great example of sort of using free agency as a tool. They picked up Tom Brady, which I guess that's another exception in terms of free agency. If you can pick up a Hall of Fame quarterback, you do that. It worked with Peyton Manning. It worked with Tom Brady. But still, the Buccaneers, they had a good team. They just knew that they needed to sort of use free agency to add a couple of pieces. All they really did was got one guy, and it happened to be the greatest quarterback of all time. But you get the one guy, and then they had other pieces around him. And a lot of what else they added were sort of just, taking flyers on unproven guys. Like Gronkowski, we didn't know if he would be able to play at a high level again. Fournette, he's, a question mark. Antonio Brown, that's kind of how they built their team, and then they drafted well. So you can't just buy a championship. It doesn't work in the NFL. There's too many spots. You have to really choose who you pay wisely. And I think that's really the main lesson, is you have to choose who you pay wisely. And again, with the exception of that one weird Jacksonville Jaguars year, the best you can really do is improve your team realistically by a couple of wins. Sometimes they'll overperform and it'll be a bit better. But the only time you should really spend big money and, break the bank in a single free agency is if you're close to winning a championship, or if you think all those guys will still be around in a few years. So, for example, a team like the New England Patriots, who currently have $66 million in cap space, and I think a lot of people are thinking like, okay, here we go. This could be something good for them. The reality is you can't gain that many wins through free agency alone. You're going to have to do other stuff. You're going to have to probably, draft very well or make some trades on top of this, because there's only so much you can do with the free agency money. And same thing for a team like Washington. Both those teams went 7-9, and, spending big money might turn them into playoff teams. Washington was a playoff team last year, but, they still had a losing record, so they could come into like a 10-6 team. But I just think the issue with something like that is you have to really get it right. And that's another thing I should mention, of course, is that I'm using this based off of, these averages. It's totally possible that if you spend the right money at the right places, you could easily give yourself more than just a couple, a win and a half. You could give yourself 3 wins or 4 wins. You're probably not going to give yourself any more than that, but still, if you can find a way to, play it right and get yourself 3 extra wins just through free agency alone, that would be huge. And if you can get another win through the draft, that puts the Patriots into 11-5, which would be a big deal. So maybe they can try and do that if they feel like they're getting the right guys. But for a team like the Jets or the Jaguars, who have a ton of cap space, but also just aren't very good, again, your deals should be looking at deals that are still going to be good deals 3 years from now. Don't really worry about this year that much. So that's kind of the thing. And I guess the flip side would be for a team like New Orleans. If you can just sign your guys, if you can find a way to keep most of your guys, you might not actually be as bad of shape as you might realize, because they won 13 games last year, and losing 1 or 2 more of those, you're still a playoff team. So there is that, although again, losing the quarterback hurts too, but there's some optimism there. At least that's what I think. What do you guys think? What is your take on all of this data? I found it very interesting, very fun video to make. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and of course, as always, thanks for watching.